we are going to look at the risk terminologies, that is the risk appetite and the risk tolerance. So, what is risk appetite? So, the risk appetite is best described as the amount of different types of risk a firm or an organization it is willing to accept to achieve its objectives. So the organizations, they are able to recognize that they cannot remove all the risks from their business. So the goal is to determine which risks fit within the organization's risk appetite and which require additional controls before they are acceptable. So for the risk appetite, you can think of the organization's risk appetite as its risk capacity. So the risk capacity is defined as the maximum like residual risk that the organization will accept after the controls are put in place. So for example, like when a company says it does not accept risk that could cost of its revenue base. So this is the risk appetite. When we talk about what is the risk appetite? Risk appetite, it is the amount of like the risk that the firm or the organization is willing to accept to achieve its objectives. So the organization, they have realized that they cannot remove all the risks from their business. So our goal, the the goal of the organization is to like determine which risks they fit within the organization's risk appetite and which require additional controls before they become acceptable. So you can think of the organization's risk appetite, for example. So when a company says that it does not accept risks that could result in a significant loss of its revenue base. So this is an example of risk appetite. So the organization, it is not accepting risks that could like cause the loss of significant revenue for the organization. So when we talk about risk tolerance, we base that on based on the risk appetite that we have defined before. We define the risk tolerance as the amount of acceptable deviation or the variation from an organization's risk appetite. So you can think of an organization's risk tolerance for a specific initiative or a program as that organization's willingness to accept the risk that remains after all the relevant controls are put in place. So, for example, let's say a company says that it does not wish to accept the risk that would cause the revenue from its top 10 customers to decline by more than 10%. So this is a risk tolerance statement. So one way to like understand the concept of risk appetite and risk tolerance is to consider the example of fast driving. So governments around the world, they recognize that the fast drivers, they create a level of risk to all the other drivers on the road. So the governments, they create speed limits designed to control the risk. So the faster a driver drives, the more risk is created. So the lower the speed limit, the lower the degree of overall risk to the other drivers. However, lower speed limits, they also like prevent the flow of traffic. They prevent the vehicles from quickly reaching their destinations. So governments must balance these concerns. So speed limits are the statements of government's risk appetite. So in this diagram, you can see the risk appetite is defined from 0 to 70 miles per hour. So this is the risk appetite, the amount of risk an organization is willing to accept to achieve its objectives. Now let's look at risk tolerance. So for taking the same example, on today's road, when we talk about the drivers, we see that the most drivers they exceed the posted speed limits. So the police officers there that are patrolling the area, they a police officer maybe like he could decide that they are only going to pull over vehicles that are traveling at 80 miles per hour or faster. So this is an example of risk tolerance. So the officer is willing to tolerate deviations or the variations up to 10 miles per hour from the posted speed limit. So the posted speed limit is the 70 miles per hour and the deviation is 10 miles per hour. So that is defined like 70 to 80 miles per hour. That is the risk tolerance. So that is the acceptable deviation from the organization's risk appetite. When we move on from the risk tolerance above 80 miles per hour, that is considered as unacceptable risk and that cannot be accepted by the organization. Any questions at this point? So now we are going to look at the step 2 of the risk management, that was the risk treatment. So the risk treatment was the second process of the risk management. It involves like prioritizing, evaluating, and implementing the appropriate security controls recommended from the risk assessment process. So because the elimination of all risk is usually impractical or close to impossible, it is the responsibility of the senior management and functional and business managers to use the least cost approach and implement the most appropriate controls to decrease the mission risk to an acceptable level. Uh, the risk has to be decreased, and it has to be it has like the minimal adverse impact on the organization's resources and the mission. So when we define risk treatment is the systematic methodology that is used by the senior management to reduce the mission risk. So risk treatment can be like it can be achieved through multiple ways, and these are the options. So acceptance, risk avoidance, risk transference, and risk limitation or mitigation. So when we talk about risk acceptance or risk assumption, we are going to accept the potential risk and we are going to continue operating the IT system. We are not going to apply any controls in this option, risk treatment option. So for the risk avoidance, what we are going to do is we are going to avoid the risk completely by eliminating the risk cause. So we are going to eliminate the cause of the risk either or the consequence of the risk. Like for example, if we are using some library that has some vulnerability that has been found, so we are not going to use that library. We are going to use any other library that does not have that vulnerability. So this is a way to avoid the risk. So the third option is risk transference, and the risk transference in this option, what we do is we try to transfer the risk by using other option to compensate for the loss. So, for example, we are going to purchase insurance. So, if an attack occurs, so there's like some kind of loss that is going to be happening. So that loss is going to be compensated by the insurance that we took for the risk transference. Last but not the least is the risk limitation and the mitigation. So in risk limitation, we are going to like limit the risk by implementing some sort of security controls that are going to minimize the impact of the threats exploitation of a vulnerability. So let's say, for example, we are going to use some sort of like technical or non-technical controls or preventive controls or detective controls that we discussed yesterday. Now we are going to look at the risk treatment strategy. Are there any questions at this point? So in the risk treatment strategy, what we are going to do is we are going to look at this diagram and we are going to start from system design. So the system is designed, then we are going to ask this question, is the system vulnerable? If the answer is no, then it means that there is no risk. So the system design, it is not vulnerable, so there is no risk. If our answer is yes to that question, we are going to move on to the second, uh, this part of the flow chart. That is, if the system design is vulnerable, is it exploitable or not? If it is not exploitable, vulnerability is there but it is not exploitable, it is not like accessible for the attacker, so there is no risk. If it is exploitable, then vulnerability to attack exists. And one factor is this, that the vulnerability to attack exists, and another factor is the threat source. So when we combine threat source and the vulnerability to attack exists, so these two, like when combined, we can say that the risk exists. Now at this point we are going to compare attacker's cost and attacker's gain. So what is the cost of launching the attack by the attacker or executing the attack on the organization? What is it going to cost the attacker to launch that attack? and what the attacker is going to gain from launching that attack. So we are going to compare these values. So let's say if the attacker's cost is greater than the gain, he is going to take advantage of the organization. So in this case we are going to accept the risk, right? So if the attacker's cost is less than the gain, is less than the gain, so when we talk about attacker, it is easier for the attacker to attack the organization to exploit the vulnerability, and he has more to gain. So it is inexpensive for him to launch the attack, and the gains are higher. So in that case, we are going to move on, and we are going to look at the loss anticipated and the threshold that we have defined. So when we talk about loss anticipated, we have some expectation of the loss, and we are going to compare the values of the loss and anticipated and the threshold we have defined. So if the loss anticipated is less than the threshold, we are going to accept the risk. Otherwise, we are going to say that it is unacceptable risk, and we are going to apply some sort of controls there to mitigate the risk. So from this strategy, we have some rules of thumb, so that we need to remember. So they are like, when we say that a vulnerability exists, we are going to look at the system design. We are going to look at how the system is designed, how can we protect the system and reduce the likelihood of a vulnerability being exercised or being exploited. So another rule of thumb is, when a vulnerability can be exploited, we are going to apply layered protections, architectural designs, and administrative controls to minimize the risk or prevent this occurrence. And when we compare the attacker's cost and gain, when the attacker's cost is less than the potential gain, we are going to apply protections to decrease an attacker's motivation by increasing the attacker's cost. So when the attacker's cost increases, he is less motivated to attack the organization. So probably he is not going to attack. So for example, we can use different system controls, such as we can limit what a system user can access and do. Can it could significantly reduce an attacker's gain. And when we talk about when the loss is too great, when the loss is too high, we are going to apply some sort of design principles, architectural designs, and technical and non-technical protections such as security controls to limit the extent of the attack, and thereby we are going to reduce the potential for loss. So let's move on. So in the risk mitigation, we are going to implement controls. So what are going to be the steps? There are 7 steps that are defined in this slide, and I am going to look at each of the steps and explain what each step comprises of. So first, we are going to prioritize action. So based on the risk levels that we defined in the risk assessment, like in the previous step, that we discussed yesterday. So we have made a risk assessment report, and we have defined some risk levels. So the implementation actions are prioritized based on that risk assessment report. So in allocating resources, top priority should be given to the risk items with unacceptable high risk rankings. So these vulnerability threat pairs will require immediate corrective action to protect an organization's interest and mission. So in this case, we are going to look at the risk assessment report, and we are going to see what sort of risk exist and how those risks are classified, and based on that we are going to prioritize the actions. Then we are going to evaluate the recommended control options. This is also something that we discussed yesterday, that based on the calculation of the risk, we are going to recommend some controls in the risk assessment report. So the control recommended in the risk assessment process may not be the most appropriate or feasible options for a specific organization on IT system. So during this step, we are going to look at the feasibility, whether it is compatible or the user is going to accept it. And we are also going to look at the effectiveness, of the controls, like how much protection it is providing, or what kind of risk mitigation is it offering of the like the recommended control options. So the objective is to like select the most appropriate control options for minimizing the risk. Then we are going to conduct a cost benefit analysis. So for the control options that we have like evaluated in the previous step, we are going to look at the cost and the benefits of those controls. And this step I will discuss in the like in the later slide as well in detail. So in the next step, in the step 4, we are going to select the controls. So on the basis of the cost benefit analysis that we have performed, the management it is going to determine the most effective like the most cost effective controls for reducing the risk to the organization's mission. So the controls selected should combine a various types of controls. It could have like a combination of technical and management controls, like to ensure the adequate security of the IT system and the organization. Then we are going to assign responsibility, that who is going to like the controls, who is going to apply that, who is going to be responsible for the implementation of those controls. So in the step 5, we are going to assign responsibility, the appropriate persons who have the appropriate expertise or the skill sets to implement the selected controls identified, and the responsibility is assigned. In the step 6, we are going to develop a safeguard implementation plan. So in the step 6, we are going to like a plan would be developed, and different threat and like the risks are going to be mentioned there. We are going to take help from the risk assessment report as well, and we are going to develop a implementation plan of the controls. And it would have like the risks, like the vulnerability threat pairs and the associated risk levels, and the recommended controls, prioritized actions from the step 1 of this of this slide. And we are also going to have some like what the plan of the how the control is going to be implemented. We are going to have some responsibilities assigned of the personnel of the teams and the staff. We are also going to have like the start date and the projected end date of the program as well in the safeguard implementation plan. So the last step is is to implement the selected control. Once the safeguard implementation plan is developed, then the selected controls are implemented in the last step. So now we are going to look at some of these steps in detail. So when we talk about like controls, we are talking about different controls. We discussed some yesterday as well. Those were preventive and detective controls, and those are also included in these controls as well. So when we talk about controls, we are talking about like in implementing the recommended controls to mitigate the risk. An organization should consider like multiple types of controls. They should consider technical management or operational controls, or they could consider a combination of these controls as well to maximize the effectiveness of controls for their IT systems and organization. And security controls, when they are used appropriately, they can prevent, limit, or deter the threat source damage or to an organization's mission. So the control recommendation process that occurred in the risk assessment step, it involves like choosing among a combination of technical or non-technical or operational security controls. So for example, when we talk about technical controls, we are talking about, let's say, an identity and access management system, or an intrusion detection system, or a firewall. When we talk about non-technical controls, we are talking about like for example, we talk about recruitment, so we are talking about like background checks, we are talking about clearance, and different things that are non-technical and related to the management. And in operational security controls, we are talking about like the physical security. We can talk about the physical security and operational security controls, such as like we can use motion detectors, or like smoke or fire detectors, sensors or alarms that are being placed in the organization. Now coming on to the cost benefit analysis that we discussed in the like in this slide. So this is the step 3 of the risk mitigation phase. So we are going to discuss what cost benefit analysis is, and what does it what is the uh, benefit of doing this analysis. So in the cost benefit analysis, like for the proposed new controls or enhanced controls, it encompasses the following. So we are going to look at the impact of implementing the new or enhanced control. We are going to determine the impact of not implementing the new or enhanced control. What is going to be the impact if we do not implement any controls? And we are going to estimate the cost of the implementation, and we are also going to assess the implementation costs and benefits against the system and data criticality to determine the importance to the organization of implementing the new controls given their cost and relative.